Alden and Faye are both 34 years old. They both have exactly $50,000 invested. On the same Tuesday evening, in two completely different kitchens, they each opened the same spreadsheet because they watched the same video promising the same thing: retire in a decade. On Faye's kitchen table, right beside her laptop, sits her husband's laptop too. On Alden's table, next to his, sits a pizza box he's been using as a mouse pad. 10 years pass. Faye is now 44 and she no longer works. Alden is 44 too, and he still does. It wasn't discipline that made the difference. Alden never skipped a single contribution. It wasn't the market either, since they were both invested in the same fund. It wasn't fees, and it wasn't luck. And it definitely wasn't the $50,000, because that number was identical down to the cent for both of them. The real thing that separated their outcomes had been sitting on the table the entire time, and it had a paycheck attached to it. Meanwhile, the thing that nearly derailed Faye was a bill neither of them had ever laid eyes on, one that doesn't show up until the day you actually quit your job. My name is Nick, and today we're doing the honest math on retiring in 10 years starting with $50,000. If you've ever pulled up a compound interest calculator at midnight, felt a rush of genuine hope, and then closed the laptop feeling somehow worse than before you opened it, go ahead and subscribe, because this is the video that explains why that keeps happening to you. And let me be completely upfront. I'm not a licensed financial advisor. This isn't financial advice, and I'm not selling you some 10-step system. What I have is a calculator and way too much spare time on my hands. Two numbers are going to carry this entire video, so let's settle on them right now and never fight about them again. 7% is the fantasy number. 5% is the realistic plan. Everything else you hear today is really just one of those two numbers wearing a disguise. And here's the promise being dangled in front of you: $50,000, 10 years, total freedom. Most people who cover this topic will tell you it's a scam. It isn't. The math genuinely works, and it's arithmetically verifiable. The problem is the math doesn't work for most of the people it's being marketed to. Those are two very different statements, and the space between them is exactly where people lose 10 years of their lives. Let's start with the appealing part. You've got $50,000, you're 34, you dump it into a total market index fund, and you never touch it for a full decade. At 7%, the fantasy rate, that grows into roughly $98,000. It doubled. And it's nowhere near enough to actually retire on, not even for a single year. So the starting money was never really the plan, it was just the deposit. The real plan is what you pile on top of it every single month for 120 consecutive months. Faye and her husband together bring home about $240,000 a year after taxes, and after a mortgage they intentionally kept modest. Faye can move $5,000 a month without it feeling like she's cutting off a limb. Faye is the $5,000 line. Alden earns $95,000 a year, which by national standards is genuinely excellent. On a solid month, Alden can set aside about $1,200. Alden is the $1,200 line. Now watch what these two lines do over the same 10 years, both starting from that identical $50,000. At $1,000 a month, you finish with roughly $271,000. At $3,000 a month, $618,000. And at $5,000 every single month for 10 straight years, you cross over into $963,000. Call it $1 million. That's Faye's story. That's the thumbnail. That's the guy standing in front of a rented Porsche on your feed telling you it's simple. And here's the uncomfortable truth. He isn't lying to you. It really is simple. But look closely at what just happened inside Faye's numbers, because this is the part I actually want you to notice. Her original $50,000 grew into $98,000 of that final balance out of $963,000 total. That's only 10% of the outcome. 90% of her retirement is money she hadn't even earned yet on the night she first opened that spreadsheet. The $50,000 in this video's title is actually the least important number in the whole equation. The real engine, the thing doing 90% of the heavy lifting, is her ability to funnel $60,000 a year into the market while still functioning as an ordinary human being. And that brings us to the part nobody puts on the thumbnail. Not because it's complicated, but because it's honestly kind of rude to say out loud. $60,000 a year isn't a savings rate, it's a full salary. With that exact amount of unused money this plan assumes you have lying around, You could hire a full-time worker at the median American wage, pay them fairly, and give them benefits. The median household income in the United States sits around $83,700 a year, straight from census data, and it's essentially unchanged since 2019, which is honestly its own separate rant for another day. $83,700 before taxes. So, saving $60,000 would mean setting aside 72% of that household's entire gross income. Not their leftover spending money, their total income. Before the government takes its share, before rent, before your kid mysteriously needs new shoes again after only 4 months. Now I already know what a bunch of you are typing right now. Nick, you're exaggerating. I'll just trim the budget. Fine, let's trim everything. That median household typically takes home around $68,000 after taxes. Subtract the $60,000 you're supposedly saving, and you're now running your entire life, housing included, on about $660 a month. That's not frugality, that's a hostage negotiation. And you'd need to hold yourself hostage for 120 straight months. Pay attention to a word I keep repeating, median, not average, because this single distinction will protect you from more financial nonsense than anything else you'll learn today. Put 9 people with zero net worth into a room alongside one billionaire. The average net worth in that room is now $100 million. Out of 10 people, not a single one actually has $100 million. That's exactly what an average does to reality. Vanguard's latest report puts the average 401k balance at around $168,000. And hearing that, you might think, okay, we're all a bit behind, but still in the game. But the median, the person literally standing in the exact middle of that line, has closer to $44,000. That gap isn't a rounding error or statistical noise. It's a handful of enormous accounts sitting on an extremely tall ladder, dragging the average so far upward that it stops describing anyone who actually exists. Whenever someone quotes you an average in personal finance, they're usually quoting a number that doesn't belong to any real living person. Here's a fact that should change how you feel about yourself for a moment. Federal Reserve data shows the median retirement balance for Americans between 35 and 44 sits around $45,000. So, if you're 34 with $50,000 and feeling like you're behind, feeling like everyone else got a head start, you somehow missed. You're actually not behind at all. You're winning. You're statistically ahead of the middle of your entire generation, which feels amazing for about 4 seconds until you realize what that actually means. The middle of your generation isn't anywhere near retirement, and being ahead of nowhere is, geographically speaking, still pretty close to nowhere. So Alden is going to lose this particular race, and I want to be honest about that right now instead of stringing you along for 15 minutes. Stick with me anyway, because Alden loses the race and still comes out ahead by the end of this video, and I'll show you exactly how. But first, Faye, because Faye actually made it, and I need to tell you that the finish line itself moves. Say you're her, you've got your $1 million. How much can you withdraw each year without running dry before you run out of life? Everybody already knows the answer, 4%, $40,000 a year. Forever. Keep that number in a completely separate pocket from the 7 and the 5, because those describe how fast your money grows, while this describes how fast you're allowed to spend it. This figure comes from William Bengen, who back in 1994 tested every 30-year retirement window in modern American financial history and found that 4.15% was the highest withdrawal rate that survived every single one, including the worst-case scenario. Great work, except for one problem. It was designed for a 30-year retirement. You're retiring at 44. If you live to 90, which is honestly the whole point of retiring early, being alive to enjoy it, then you're not funding 30 years, you're funding 46. You've taken a rule that was stress-tested for a marathon, and you're trying to use it to plan an expedition. Morningstar reruns this same calculation annually, but looking forward instead of backward, factoring in what stocks and bonds actually cost right now. Their current figure for a 30-year retirement is 3.9%. And remember, you need 46 years, not 30. 3.9% of $1 million is $39,000 a year, before taxes, before health insurance, for the rest of your natural life. Congratulations, you pulled off the impossible and saved $1 million in a single decade, and your reward is a budget that would make a public school teacher nervous. And that's actually the good scenario, assuming the market cooperates, which brings us to Dave. Dave is the third person in this story, and Dave is the one who genuinely keeps me up at night. Dave ran the exact same spreadsheet as everyone else, except he used 10% because 10% is the historical average return of the S&P 500. Dave isn't foolish. That's a real, documented number. It just describes the past rather than the future. Here's what the professionals actually paid to forecast the next 10 years, conveniently the exact length of this plan, are currently saying. Vanguard's model projects American stock returns somewhere between 3.5% and 5.5% annually. Goldman Sachs published a figure around 3%. BlackRock lands in the 5s. JP Morgan is the optimist of the group at roughly 6.7%. Nobody is projecting 10%, nobody is even close to it. The reason is unglamorous. Stocks are simply expensive right now. The Shiller-Cape ratio, which is essentially the market's price divided by a decade of smoothed earnings, currently sits around 41. The only other time in roughly 140 years it was meaningfully higher was late 1999, and I'll let you look up on your own what happened right after that. So Dave contributes $3,000 a month for 10 years. At 10%, he ends up with $750,000. At 4%, he ends up with $516,000. But here's the part that actually matters, and it isn't the subtraction itself. Dave doesn't discover this in year 1, he discovers it in year 9. He's 43 years old. There's a sticky note on his monitor that has read $750,000 for 9 years straight. That number survived 2 job changes and a cross-country move. He said no to things because of that sticky note. And then one ordinary morning, he opens the account the way he has 1,000 times before, and it reads $516,000. There is no version of the next 12 months where Dave recovers that missing $234,000. He automated everything. He indexed properly. He never panic sold during any crash. The market simply handed him a completely different decade than the one written on his sticky note, and then the internet told him he probably just didn't want it badly enough. Now, to be fair, these forecasters have absolutely been wrong before. They've predicted mediocre returns for over a decade straight, and American stocks kept climbing anyway, making every single one of those models look ridiculous in hindsight. Mean reversion is a beautiful theory that keeps somehow missing its own train. So maybe artificial intelligence transforms everything. We get another roaring decade, and Dave ends up rich and smug. But building a 10-year plan around a 10% assumption isn't investing. It's betting that the least likely outcome is somehow the guaranteed one. And you won't find out you were wrong until year 9, when there's no time left to correct course. Before we get to the bill I promised you earlier, I want to talk about what these 10 years actually feel like while you're living through them, because nobody ever films this part. Alden is 6 years into the plan, and year 6 doesn't feel like a spreadsheet at all. It feels like doing mental math in your parked car outside a restaurant before you go inside. It feels like your closest friend getting married in Portugal and you telling everyone you simply couldn't get the time off work, which isn't actually the real reason. It feels like your one working car making a strange new noise on the highway, and what washes over you isn't annoyance, it's something closer to dread because your emergency fund is now load-bearing. It feels like being 39 and explaining to your mother, again, why you're still renting an apartment. It feels like being simultaneously the most responsible person you know and the most exhausted person you know for 6 more years, while nobody applauds any of it. That's the real cost of admission, not the $60,000. That part is just arithmetic. This part is the actual price, and here's what's waiting for you at the finish line. You retire at 44. You are now 21 years away from qualifying for Medicare. 21 years of buying your own health insurance on the open market. As an individual with no employer, no group plan, and by design, almost no visible income. At the start of 2026, the enhanced subsidies that had been keeping Affordable Care Act premiums lower expired. Net premiums for millions of people roughly doubled overnight. The average benchmark plan now costs north of $600 a month, and the subsidy cliff returned with it, meaning that above a certain income level, roughly $84,000 for a couple, you don't get a smaller subsidy, you get absolutely nothing. Cross that line by even a single dollar, and a household can fall from heavily subsidized coverage to $22,000 a year in premiums. $22,000, that isn't some minor line item. That's a mortgage payment. That's the bill, the one that never appeared in either spreadsheet. It doesn't show up on the day you retire. It shows up the day you actually tell your boss you're leaving. Faye has $1 million, and she's permitted to spend $39,000 of it each year. $22,000 of that can go straight to a health insurance company before she's purchased a single thing that makes life worth retiring into in the first place. She did everything correctly, and she's still negotiating with an insurance company for permission to be free. I call this the leash, and I want you to see exactly how it's constructed, because none of it happened by accident. Your employer purchases your health insurance using pre-tax dollars, a benefit worth thousands annually that instantly evaporates the moment you try to buy it yourself. So ask the only question that actually matters here: who benefits from this arrangement? Your employer benefits from having a workforce that can't afford to leave. Insurance companies benefit from captive customers who never shop around. And the subsidy cliff almost poetically punishes the exact income bracket most likely to attempt early retirement, while leaving the genuinely wealthy who can simply self-insure completely untouched. Nobody in that entire room profits from your freedom. This isn't some grand conspiracy. Nobody sat in a boardroom and deliberately designed a leash. It's actually worse than that. Every single participant had their own reason to build their small piece of the system, and not one of them had any reason to build an exit ramp. So when you stay one more year at a job you've clearly outgrown, purely because of the insurance, understand exactly what that is. That isn't a failure of nerve on your part. That's the machine functioning precisely as intended. You aren't being irrational, you're being contained. And honestly, this is exactly the kind of thing that's far easier to work through alongside other people running the same numbers than it is alone at midnight with only a calculator and a rising sense of dread for company. That's why I started a school community. The link's in the description. And it's where people post their real spreadsheets, their actual premium quotes, and honest breakdowns of what happened when they stress-tested their own plans and watched them fall apart. Come argue with me about it. I'd genuinely welcome that. So what actually works, realistically? First, understand that the money isn't permanently locked up, which is the most common reason people quit before even starting. I can't touch it until I'm 59 and a half, they say. Actually, you can. There's the Roth conversion ladder, where you convert retirement funds into a Roth account during your low-income early retirement years, wait 5 years, and then withdraw it penalty-free. There's the Rule of 55. And there's Rule 70-2E, officially known as substantially equal periodic payments, which sounds less like a legitimate legal loophole and more like a diagnosis. Look up all three. They're completely real, entirely legal, and the only thing guarding them is that the paperwork is boring enough to function as its own security system. Second, fill your tax-advantaged accounts first. In 2026, you can contribute $24,500 to a 401k, $7,500 to an IRA, and either $4,400 or $8,750 for a family into a health savings account. The HSA is the only account in the entire tax code that's tax-free going in, tax-free while it grows, and tax-free coming back out, which is either a drafting mistake or a genuine act of mercy. And at this point, I've stopped trying to figure out which. You just learned that healthcare is the exact thing that kills plans like this, and the HSA is essentially the antidote. Third, claim your entire employer match, all of it. It's the only guaranteed 100% return available to any private citizen anywhere, and people forfeit it every single year because on day one at a new job, the enrollment paperwork ranked as maybe the fourth most interesting thing on their desk. But none of these is actually the biggest lever available to you. The biggest lever is the one nobody particularly wants to hear about. Over 10 years, a $20,000 raise that you refuse to inflate your lifestyle around beats every single spending cut you'll ever make. Spending cuts eventually hit a floor. There's a limit to how little you can spend on groceries. Income has no such ceiling. You can always earn more, and I know exactly how that sounds. Just make more money is the kind of advice that makes people want to hurl their laptop across the room, but it happens to be the true answer. The reason the internet would rather obsess over lattes is that a latte is a problem you can solve in one Tuesday afternoon, while income is a problem you solve gradually over years. One of those makes for a punchier video, the other one actually makes you money, Which brings us back to Alden. $95,000 a year, $1,200 a month. Alden is not retiring in 10 years, and no spreadsheet on this planet is going to change that fact. But here's what he gets instead, starting at 34 with $50,000 and $1,200 a month for 10 years, and we're using 5%. The realistic plan, not 7, the fantasy, because I refuse to spend an entire video arguing against overly optimistic numbers, and then quietly rely on one myself when it's convenient. By 44, Alden has roughly $237,000, and now he simply stops. He never contributes another dollar. He leaves it completely untouched. By age 60, that money has grown to roughly $630,000 in today's terms. Alden didn't retire at 44. Alden did something more attainable and, honestly, I'd argue more valuable. At 44, Alden finished. He is permanently done saving for retirement. Every single dollar from that morning onward belongs entirely to the life he's actually living. The house, the kid, the trip, the year off, the career change he was previously too scared to make, back when his old age depended entirely on his next paycheck. This is called Coast Fire, and it's the version of this whole plan that's genuinely available to an ordinary person with an ordinary job during an ordinary decade. Faye purchased a finish line. Alden purchased a floor. And it turns out a floor is exactly the thing that finally lets you take real risks. So can you actually retire in 10 years starting with $50,000? Yes, if you can save around $5,000 a month, which realistically means earning close to $200,000 a year, which honestly means you probably didn't need this video in the first place. And that's the punchline sitting at the center of nearly all financial content online. It's written by people who already won and watched by people who haven't yet. But the underlying machine, the automatic contributions, the index funds, the tax-advantaged accounts, the stubborn refusal to inflate your lifestyle every time you get a raise, that machine actually runs at every single income level. It just pays out differently depending on where you start. At $240,000 a year, it buys you back an entire decade of your life. At $95,000 a year, it buys you the end of financial fear by age 44, which honestly isn't a consolation prize at all. That's actually most of what people are chasing when they say they want to retire early. They don't really want to stop working, they want to stop being afraid. So here's the question I'd genuinely like you to sit with, and it's the one I want to watch you debate in our school community. Forget the number entirely. If you never had to save another dollar for retirement again, if your future were already fully funded and every paycheck from this point forward belonged purely to you, what would you actually do come Monday? Because the honest answer to that question is worth considerably more than $50,000. And unlike that $50,000, you already have it.